Okay, looks like we're live. Yep. So I've been working on our next step here, which is to start rescuing Kerbals. Uh, we still need to figure out ways of gathering more science, and I think we've got the funds nailed. We can do rescues and we can do tourists. As we get more science, it's going to be harder and harder to meet the tourist needs because they're going to want to go further out. So I'm probably going to stack up some funds before we head out to the moon or anything. But we've got 4 Kerbals in orbit that we are trying to rescue. And it's going to be a bit of a task. I did a couple of attempts to rescue, allowing MechJeb to set up nodes for me. I don't want to do it that way eventually, but that'll help me firm up the plans for what stages I want to go through. And I found some things I had to fix. So basically, to do a rescue, you have to launch, get up either above or below your target, not on the same orbit, but you want to go above it or below it so you can either have it catch up to you or you catch up to it. And then you do a transfer down to its orbit at the appropriate time so that you come close and fine tune it on the way to get as close as you can. Then when you get there, you can synchronize with the vessel and move the pilot over and return. So there's a couple of tricks there. So our phases are, let me bring up here. We need to select a target. Well, once we have got ourselves into a circular orbit, there's a parking orbit I'm going to put us in, which is well away from any of these rescuees. So while we're at the parking orbit, we're going to select a target. We're going to fix our inclination, because each target may be in an independent inclined orbit, and of course my launches are rather casual about their inclination. Once you get a proper inclination, then the rest of it is to match the periapsis and match the position. So first we want to at some point do a Hohmann transfer so that we end up with our periapsis matching the periapsis of the other spacecraft. The next step is to set up a single orbit that is longer, so we take enough longer to get around so that when we come back, we're synchronized. Now, what MechJeb likes to do a single Hohmann transfer that lands you there exactly as it gets there, so it doesn't do the extra loop out and back, but I'm not sure that I can write the math for the thing MechJeb is doing. Once we have a intercept, we then need to match velocities with the target, and that's going to be, it may be 100 dV, main engines, boom. And once we've got matched, we're going to be somewhere in the neighborhood, maybe 10 meters away, maybe 100 meters away. We're going to want to carefully approach. And then we're going to want to sit there while I use the jetpacks to move the people around. And then we do the normal other stuff. And what I found out was, as I was testing this in MechJeb, I forgot that we needed RCS. So I had to go spend another 90 science picking up the RCS jets and RCS fuel tanks. The fuel tanks are clipped inside. So we did spend some more science on research, which means we are down to 50 science left, and we're at a stage where every research is 90. So we can't do any more research until we pick up a bunch more science. So that's where we are. That's a lot of steps. So the first step I'm going to attack is, well, I've got select was easy. Select basically says, we've got some logic that says, is our target appropriate? And we're going to do that all over the place. And we're going to wait for that to trigger. It's down at the bottom. Is select needed and check target. Basically, we have a list of valid targets, which are the various vessels that are out there. And we can detect, do we have a target? And if we have a target, is it inside target vessels? And there's two things we want to do to check this. When we boot, we want to look at our current target and compare it with something we've persisted. And maybe we update what we've persisted. I still need to figure out what my priority is going to be there. It could very well be that we restore. If you've got a target and you don't have something persisted, clearly you want the target. If you don't have a target and you've got something persisted, you want what you've persisted. So the question is, what do you do when they're both there? And for now, the initialization, this happens when we first boot. If we have a target, then we use it. So I'm going to say that on boot, we're just going to accept whatever target is set, no matter what is in the persist. So if you've got something targeted, it'll update what's persisted. That's fine. If we don't have a target, then we see if it's persisted and we use it. Once we're running, we don't want to do that. What we want to say is, if we have a target, we might reject it. Hold on. Did I end up? I ended up following target anyway, so I may be able at some point to refactor these two functions back together again. I've been trying to simplify the logic, and if I simplified enough, those go together, that's great. Anyway, my main focus isn't on the target selection. It's on the inclination. So when we get in here, we could assume that we have target, and target is a vessel that we want to synchronize with. And this logic actually should work whether our target is a vessel or an asteroid or the MUN or whatever. Just has to be something orbiting the same body. So normally what you do is you say find the ascending node or descending node, whichever is closest. And then you consider that point. You say, what angle do I need to rotate? What is my relative inclination? And then you set up a burn to kink your orbit by that much. Now, a whole lot of calculation going on there, including finding the ascending node. And the less your inclination is, the more that node will skitter around. So that's the same sort of irregularity as trying to use Euler angles when you're trying to control something that might go through the vertical. So instead, I thought, what if we do this? Consider the target orbit plane as being the base plane, the XY plane for a coordinate system. Okay, so if it's actually tilted, we're gonna make it straight, and we're orbiting like this. Now, as it turns out, if I turn off my source code here, it turns out that these vessels I've got are in fact in the equatorial plane. This logic is going to work even if things are, even if my target is inclined. But consider the orbital plane. As we orbit around it, we're going around and around and around. We're bobbing up and down through this plane. And if you think of the coordinate system as oriented by this plane but centered at the vehicle, then our motion is merely up and down. Well, what can we do when we're up and down? We're oscillating across it. Now, it's not a pendulum. The equations are a little weird, but when you're near crossing the plane, your vertical velocity is pretty linear. So what we can do is we can drop a perpendicular to this plane and say, what's the perpendicular distance? Then we can say, what's the perpendicular speed? Now, the perpendicular speed is how much delta V we're going to need. Boom, that falls right out of it. And actually, we're going to be burning. So here's the orbital plane here. Here's our orbital plane. We're actually burning perpendicular to our orbital plane, so we don't change our delta V. So we'll be off. We're actually going to be off. We would need to divide our thrust by the cosine of that angle. But that angle is going to be like 5, 10, 15 degrees. So not going to worry about that this time. We may correct this later if we start getting large corrections. But we know our delta V because that's the velocity that we're dropping through the plane. We won't know it until we're about to drop through the plane because as time goes by, our velocity changes. But That's okay. We're a error correcting system. So we know our distance, we know our speed. Well, we know that if we knew our if we knew the time and the if we know the time and the acceleration and the boundary point. The boundary point is at time 0, position is 0, velocity is 0. And we're going to roll it back so we are at negative time. So at some negative time, we have a velocity. The velocity is opposite in sign from our position. And we have a constant acceleration, which is away from the plane. So we're decelerating. So the acceleration sign is the reverse of the velocity, which is the reverse of the position. Okay, makes sense? I hope it makes sense. These equations are really easy. Everybody who came out of elementary school has probably learned velocity is acceleration times time. And everybody that's gone through high school has probably learned that position is acceleration times the square of time over 2. So we have 2 equations in 2 unknowns. We can solve that. So first is we use the first equation to solve for A, substitute that into the second one, and now our second equation becomes x equals vt over 2. We know v and we know t. Oh, wait a minute. No, x equals vt over 2. We now have to solve for t because we know x and v. So t is 2x over v. So if v were 0, this is where we are as high up as possible, as far down as possible. If v is 0, we're never getting there. So there's going to be some logic in here for saying, oh, we're not close enough yet. We're not moving fast enough yet. But that gets us our t. And if we know t and v, we can get a. So there's the a and the t. Once we have a, is the desired acceleration, we can look at our maximum thrust and our ship mass, and we can figure out what we need to set our throttle to get that acceleration. And when we're farther away, in theory, a lower throttle setting would cause us to slow down and stop right on the plane. If it were a flat space, but it's not. We are not in an inertial frame. We're in a rotating frame. So we couldn't just set it and forget it. We would have to do an error controller anyway. What we want to do is we want to wait until this computed thrust is fairly high, like over half of our engine capacity. So we wait until the last minute and we turn on the engines, kind of like a suicide burn, where you wait until the last minute and then light the engines up to 100%. And just as you touch down, your engines shut off and you're at 0 velocity and 0 position and 0 acceleration and 0 everything. So we're not going to go that nuts, but I am going to wait until we get some decent throttle. So there's the computations: time, acceleration, force is acceleration times mass, and throttle is force divided by the maximum thrust, 0 to 1. We are going to have to decide how often we want this stage, if we're doing this as a stage in the mission, how often we want the stage called back. And if we're not doing anything too terribly interesting, we'll do it every 10 seconds. We'll change that later on if we decide we're interesting. If we're not doing anything specific, well, I'm going to start off by saying the next command for throttle is going to be this computed throttle value. And that's going to be from -1 to +1. Actually, it could be anything at this point. And the direction we want to thrust is going to be our HS is our angular momentum vector, which for our purposes, if our vessel is on this orbital plane, it's this way. So the angular momentum vectors are perpendicular to our plane. If we thrust in that direction, we are not changing our angular momentum. We will not be perturbing our periapsis radius, our apoapsis radius, our eccentricity, all of that. The only thing we're going to be changing is the inclination. At least we would if we used lock to set this up so that it perfectly followed it. We're not doing that yet. I may do that at some point. Anyway, so our default is going to be thrust in the positive direction by this throttle amount, which actually could be negative. But what if it's negative? If we computed a negative throttle, that means that we need to thrust downward instead of upwards. So that would be if we were on the other side. Right now, we are on there. So if we look at the other node, let's center on Kerbal. So that would be this situation here, where our orbit is ascending through the target plane. Oh, and I've been talking about code with it turned off. So here's where we are here. We have done our computations of the various quantities. We have set some defaults that say call back in 10 seconds, but burn upward at the calculated thing. If our calculated command is negative, it means we want to burn downwards, so we flip the sign on everything. Okay, that's fine. If the computed command is greater than 1, we can't get there from here. Well, literally what this is telling us is we could burn at 100% throttle and we would still blow through that plane. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if CT is greater than 1, we're going to not use the throttle and we're going to turn the dead zone back on. So there's a dead zone flag we will use. We'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, very short moment down at the bottom there. So basically the dead zone is something where I track whether the engine has been on or off. And if I shut it off because we're going too far, I'm going to turn this to true. So that the next time we come through here, we know that we're not burning. We need to wait for the throttle to need to be big. We'll get to that. Second thing, the time value. In our equations up here, these are relative to 0 being the time at which we stop on the plane, and negative being the time leading up to it. So if this computed time value is positive, we're actually receding from the plane rather than approaching it. So if we're receding from the plane, we're going to do nothing. I'm not going to try to correct our inclination, overcorrect it, and come back to matching the plane and then level it out. I'm going to wait for us to get around to the other side. So now, next thing is, if the computed throttle is bigger than 10%, fairly small, we are going to start calling this at 10 hertz. So we're going to do this 10 updates a second when we have a situation where we would need more than 10% of our throttle to stop at the plane. And we're going to cancel the time warp. So here's we're getting close. We need to perk our ears up. So now the dead zone logic. Basically, we're not going to turn on the throttle until we need 60%. But once we've turned it on, we're going to leave it on as long as we need any throttle at all. So if the dead zone is turned on and we have a command, and the command is less than 60%, then set the command to 0. So that implements the dead zone. If the command is greater than 0, if we still have a command, which would be a larger command the first time through, or any command at all subsequently when dead zone is set, is off. If we have any command at all, we're going to force dead zone to false. Otherwise it's 0, so we're going to leave it true. Well, set it to true. So if the command ever drops to 0, we're back in the dead zone. Once I'm done checking the dead zone, if I actually have any sort of command, I'm going to look at the angle between where we're facing and what direction we should be thrusting. If we're supposed to be thrusting up, I don't want to turn on the engines when we're pointed down. That's bad. I'm assuming that we have enough control authority on this vessel to get us turned around. We actually have our CS jets. We shouldn't need them for this. We have reaction wheels that get us moving, and that should be enough because we can get ourselves pointed in the right direction well in advance. If we get through all of that gauntlet, CT should only survive if we're pointed in the right direction and we need we need some thrust, or we've had some thrust and we need some, and we're facing the right direction, and CS should be set to the correct up or down value. We can load those into the global variables that we have locked our throttle and steering to, make sure those are locked, and continue. So let's check it. Let's actually see it in action. So get rid of the editor. So currently we are receding from the equatorial plane and we're below it. Let's go see if we can synchronize with Legos. So set her as target. Now we immediately have the target message up here. So we've recognized the target and we have pointed ourselves in the correct direction. Even though we are receding from the plane, we're still going to get ourselves pointed in the right way. We should be pointed, well, we're going to have to be pointed down because we're going to come up on the ascending node. So we want to thrust down to tilt our orbital plane like that. If we get out of map mode, we can see indeed that we are facing, well, south, not down. Down is toward the planet, but south. And this is going to do nothing until it gets to the ascending node. I am not confident in my code that turns off the warp. But we can warp close and I can turn it off manually. We're pointing the right way, but it will roll us to basically having the up of the. So what we really want is we want the door to be faced away from the planet. So if Jeb were to do an EVA, he'd be on this side facing down at the planet. So this doesn't tell us how far it is to the ascending node, but I can check by placing a maneuver node there. So this maneuver is in it's in a minute and a half. Let's get rid of it. I'm going to warp us closer. Oh, and see there, the warp cut out. So apparently my warp cancel is good enough. It might be interesting to see if there's any messages on the terminal. Okay, we've confirmed the vessel, but we've had no other diagnostic messages here. Now I want to watch this from here so we can see our ascending node change. And if we look here, we can look at approach information and we get nothing. Because this isn't showing us the relative inclination, but here, this is the MechJeb display and it shows me target inclination of 0. That's not good. What I want to see is the relative inclination. Here we are. So 3, 2, 2.5, 2, 1.5, 1. So yeah, it makes nice progress on that. And we see here that my final relative inclination is 0.01 degrees. That should be close enough for the old man. And now we are in the next stage, which is the periapsis stage. I haven't even started working on that. I've decided that for a lot of this stuff, the testing loop through kOS is so slow right now that what I'm going to do is go develop these things and then bring them back to the stream and show them off. Anyway, so there's our interception. Now, this logic works whether I'm getting in plane with a person being rescued, or I can get in plane with the Mun, or I can get in plane with Minmus. Or I could if I didn't. See, if I do it now, see, RV is going to reject my attempt to synchronize to Minmus. I could disable that just for example's sake. Let's disable the check that it's a actual vessel. If target vessel is fine, if T is less than 0, well, we're going to just disable this. Just like that. Oh, wait a minute. There's still the idea that it might be if target equals quote quote. So we're only going to reject an empty target. So we need to reboot. And thanks to our mission control, this will reboot, reload, update, and put us back in this mode of waiting for this guy. So we set him as target, and we have accepted that body. And now, what do we see here? We see an ascending node of 6 degrees coming up fairly soon. We are flat, and Minmus is not. So I am going to warp up near it, and I will let it stop the warp. Now, it's likely that we wouldn't be able to actually transit out to Minmus on 383 meters per second, but we should certainly be able to match inclinations on it. Okay, so now we're running in the fast loop. Notice that the closest approach to Minmus is flickering back and forth. Seems like I move really fast when I'm trying to quickly get in and fix something, but when I'm just waiting for it to happen, it just takes forever. So we started, it's a fairly significant correction, so I started before getting the ascending node. You see that it is correcting in the direction that will match the green line back there. And voila, the blue line matches the green line. And now the descending node says that our offset is 0.0 degrees. So we actually hit 0.0003 degrees as our final value. And we still have 100 meters per second left. So in theory, I could burn retrograde and get us home. In actuality, at this point, I will reset because I need to start on the development of the next stage, which is matching my periapsis to something, some part of the orbit of the destination. I would like to get away from attempting to find an ascending node or periapsis, because those skitter around as the orbit becomes zero inclination or zero eccentricity. So what I may do is just pick a point and say I'm going to do a Holman transfer that matches tangent to the orbit somewhere. Now maybe that's by looking at its eccentricity, picking periapsis if it's eccentric or just whatever. The point is to not have my destination point skitter around from iteration to iteration. I want it to be something stable. So that's it for now. I will do a new stream when I've got the periapsis